Hey guys, tonight we are going to turn the historical clock back to the Tudor era, but not to meet Henry VIII. We are going to explore the story of Margaret Tudor, the sister that history has almost forgotten. Imagine this. You are only a 13-year-old girl, but you are already a diplomatic weapon in a court constantly living in fear of assassination. This princess girl didn't just learn to smile when her heart was bleeding. She was trained to become a royal spy, a woman married off to her family's arch-enemy, the King of Scotland. Margaret swore she would serve England from within, but she fell in love, and a single kiss destroyed the entire 1,000-year alliance. She dared to betray the throne that birthed her to choose a new kingdom. The consequence? She had to look directly into the eyes of her brother, Henry VIII, when he ordered the hunt for her own children like political pawns. Margaret Tudor was the only woman bold enough to rewrite the rules of royalty, not with a sword but with her own defiance and heart. She is not a forgotten queen. She is the dangerous flame that history tried to extinguish. What drove this Tudor girl to risk everything to claim her autonomy? And why did her family try to erase her name from the chronicles? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please let me know where you are watching from and what time it is. Your local time. It's amazing to know we are relaxing together across different time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Margaret Tudor was born in the chill of November, in the year 1489. The war that had placed her father on the throne had ended only 4 years earlier, yet the smell of smoke and steel still lingered in the English air. Her father, Henry VII, was no ancient monarch born of an unbroken royal line. He was a Welsh exile, a man who had lived 14 years in Brittany, plotting, waiting, calculating how to seize a throne that his blood could barely claim. When he defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, he founded a new dynasty on the fragile bones of the old one. It was a crown that glittered but trembled. And in that trembling kingdom, Margaret came into the world not as a beloved daughter, but as a symbol her father's quiet weapon, a girl who might one day buy peace with her smile. From her earliest breath, the Tudor household was steeped in unease. Enemies of the new dynasty, Yorkist claimants, ambitious nobles, disinherited warriors lingered everywhere, waiting for a chance to strike. Margaret's cradle, wrapped in velvet, rested in a fortress of suspicion. She would grow up surrounded, not by laughter, but by whispers, not by lullabies, but by lessons. Before she learned to write her own name, she learned the meaning of survival. Every morning she watched her mother, Elizabeth of York herself, the daughter of a fallen king, move through the court with a perfect, practiced serenity. That quiet grace was not born of comfort, but of necessity. In the Tudor court, silence could save lives. By the age of 10, Margaret had already begun to understand that she was not a child in her own right, but a thread in a vast political tapestry. Her father's crown was a prize that many still considered stolen, and so every Tudor child became both heir and hostage to the future. Henry VII raised his sons to rule and his daughters to negotiate. A daughter, he once told his council, is a treaty waiting to happen. It was not affection, but arithmetic. Each of his children was a number in an equation that might secure the fragile Tudor line. In those early years, Margaret's education reflected her destiny. Tutors instructed her in Latin, French, and the careful grace of the dance. Every curtsy was a rehearsal for diplomacy. Every word she spoke was measured for its potential use. Even the fine art of embroidery was not mere pastime, but practice, a symbol of patience, perfection, and obedience. Behind the delicate movements of her needle, she learned something else. That power often wears a soft face. She watched, listened, absorbed. Her father's council chambers, filled with men debating war and taxes, fascinated her more than any tapestry. She studied how her father manipulated foreign ambassadors with a mixture of courtesy and threat, how he hid steel beneath velvet. At 13, Margaret had already begun to see through the glitter of the court. She understood that royal daughters were not people, they were promises. The prettier and more accomplished she became, the higher her price would be when it came time to secure a marriage alliance. And yet, deep inside, the young princess was not as compliant as she appeared. The smile she gave at banquets, the downcast eyes during her lessons, these were masks she wore with growing skill. Beneath them, her mind was sharpening, patient and watchful. The Tudor world into which she was born was built on mistrust. Henry VII ruled through paranoia, but it was a paranoia that kept him alive. He feared rebellion, assassination, betrayal, even from those closest to him. That fear, like a shadow, passed quietly into his daughter's soul. From him, Margaret learned that information was as powerful as any sword. To know what others desired, feared, or lied about was to hold them by the throat without ever raising a hand. By the time she entered her 12th year, Margaret could already read the hidden meanings in a smile, the tremor in a voice, the pause before a sentence. Diplomats twice her age found themselves disarmed by the poised young girl who seemed merely curious. Henry believed he was moulding a perfect diplomatic bride, a tool to strengthen alliances. But what he truly created was something far less predictable, a mind capable of seeing beyond the script written for her. Outside the palace, the world still trembled between peace and war. The border with Scotland, wild and blood-soaked for centuries, flared with violence. Across the sea, the old Yorkist exiles plotted to restore their claim. Inside, the Tudor dynasty stood proud but precarious, a house of cards dressed as a castle. And in one quiet corner of that castle, a girl of 13 sat by a window, her face lit by the thin winter light. She was embroidering a white rose entwined with a red one, the symbol of unity between York and Lancaster. But her thoughts were far away, already wandering toward the north, toward the distant hills where her fate would one day unfold. Margaret Tudor was learning, silently, that to survive in a world built by men, a woman must master the art of stillness, the illusion of gentleness, and the courage to wait for her moment. The smile on her lips might have looked sweet, but it was also a weapon. And though she did not yet know it, that weapon would one day shake two kingdoms. Henry VII did not raise his children to play. He raised them to serve, not through sword or spear, but through the quiet blade of diplomacy. In his mind, a royal marriage was a treaty wrapped in silk, a transaction where a daughter's smile could build empires or end wars. While her younger brother Henry played at soldiers in the nursery, Margaret was already training for the battlefield of courts and thrones. Her weapons were not armor and steel, but grace, language, and silence. From dawn until dusk, her days were filled with lessons that polished every edge of her being. She studied French, the language of kings and courts, Latin, the tongue of scholars and popes, and even a trace of Spanish, as her father sought to weave connections with the rising power of Ferdinand and Isabella. Every mispronounced word, every imperfect curtsy, was corrected with patient precision. Dance lessons were not leisure, they were rehearsal for survival. A single misstep at a royal ceremony could insult an ambassador, wound a treaty, or spark a war. Even embroidery had its purpose. As Margaret's needle slipped through gold thread, she was practicing the patience required to endure endless councils, where men spoke of her as though she were not there at all. By the age of 10, Margaret already knew the quiet cruelty of her position. Royal daughters were not people. They were currency. The brighter their eyes, the smoother their manners, the higher their worth upon the chessboard of Europe. A less perceptive child might have accepted that fate. But Margaret watched. She noticed how her father smiled without warmth, how he spoke in riddles, how his promises changed depending on who was listening. She saw the rhythm of power, the way affection could be feigned, threats concealed beneath flattery, and favors traded like coins. At council dinners, she sat quietly behind her mother, pretending to focus on her food while her mind gathered every word. She learned that even silence could be a strategy. To know what others desired was to make them predictable, and predictability, in the Tudor world, meant control. Henry VII, ever cautious, kept his court wrapped in layers of secrecy. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire came and went through the polished halls of Westminster, each one cloaked in charm and deceit. Margaret watched them all. She memorized accents, gestures, and tones. She saw that alliances were not built on trust, but on fear, and that the king, her father, was both master and prisoner of that fear. By the year 1501, Margaret had turned 12. Her lessons had become subtler, her understanding sharper. She began to read not just letters, but between the lines. She could detect the faint tremor in an envoy's voice that betrayed uncertainty. She could sense the pause in her father's speech when he was about to lie. Words fascinated her not for their beauty, but for their danger. A single word spoken carelessly could alter the course of kingdoms. Her tutors marveled at her quickness. Her father, ever pragmatic, praised her obedience, but underestimated her perception. He believed he was crafting a perfect diplomatic bride, a princess so polished and pliant that foreign courts would be enchanted. What he was truly creating, though, was something unpredictable. A young woman capable of observation so keen it bordered on defiance. When visiting envoys tried to charm her with compliments, she responded with a soft smile and eyes that gave nothing away. Some mistook her quietness for innocence, others for shyness. Few realized that Margaret was cataloguing every phrase they uttered, every boast they made, every inconsistency between their words and their gestures. She turned conversation into chess, every response calculated, every silence purposeful. Occasionally Henry would test her. He would summon her to his chambers, spread a series of letters before her, and ask what she could deduce. The child would glance across the lines of diplomatic code, then quietly point out which phrases were lies and which were truths disguised as threats. Her father would laugh, proud of her wit, proud of his creation. But he did not see that in sharpening her mind, he was teaching her to question authority, including his own. The court itself was a living lesson in duplicity. Behind the glittering banquets and polished silver, the air always hummed with rumours, rebellions brewing in the north. Pretenders whispered to still live, nobles shifting allegiance like sand. Margaret grew accustomed to the language of tension. When a nobleman bowed too deeply, she wondered what he was hiding. When her father smiled too broadly, she wondered who he was preparing to betray. It was an education not just in etiquette but in survival. Her mother, Elizabeth of York, offered a softer mirror to her father's cold precision. From her, Margaret learned compassion, but also resignation. Elizabeth had been the daughter of an enemy house and the wife of a conqueror, her entire existence a compromise. "Peace," she once told her daughter in a rare private moment, "is never given freely, it is paid for." Those words lodged deep in Margaret's heart, though she did not yet understand how personally she would pay that price. Late at night, when the court finally grew still, Margaret would lie awake in her chambers, listening to the distant footsteps of guards and the muffled creak of doors closing. The great castle was like a living creature, always awake, always watching. Sometimes she dreamed of escape of a world beyond treaties and titles, where she could speak freely and be more than her father's pawn. But even in her dreams, duty followed her like a shadow. By the time dawn broke and the bells called the court to prayer, Margaret would rise, smooth her gown, and fix the practiced smile upon her face. The lessons would begin again. A new dance, a new tutor, another day to perfect the art of being useful. The girl who had once held dolls now held the attention of ambassadors twice her age. And though Henry VII saw in her only a piece on his diplomatic board, she was becoming something far more dangerous, a mind learning how to see the game itself. For now, though, she remained silent, patient, and watchful. A small, graceful figure gliding through the candlelit corridors of the Tudor palace, already learning that power was not in speaking the loudest, but in knowing when to say nothing at all. The news came like a whisper through the corridors of Richmond Palace. Scotland wanted peace. For the first time in living memory, after centuries of hostility and blood, a Scottish king was ready to negotiate. To the court of Henry VII, it was almost unthinkable. For 300 years, the border between England and Scotland had been marked not by treaties but by graves, by the cries of men who had died at places like Stirling Bridge in the year 1297 and Bannockburn in the year 1314, where the proud armies of England had been shattered beneath the banners of freedom. Now, in the first years of the 16th century, the message that reached the Tudor throne carried both promise and peril. King James IV of Scotland, a man of 30, wanted to end the blood feud. His proposal was simple in words and devastating in consequence. A marriage, binding the crowns through blood, peace bought with the life of a child. For Margaret, the meaning of that decision sank deep and cold. Scotland was no mere foreign land. It was the enemy, a place painted in the English imagination as rough, wild and barbarous. In every ballad, Every fireside tale. Scotland was where English soldiers vanished, where ambition froze in the northern mists. Her mother, Elizabeth of York, wept when she heard. Her grandmother, the formidable Lady Margaret Beaufort, who had engineered the Tudor rise to power, warned that 13 was far too young for such a perilous task. But the warning did not matter. In the year 1502, the Treaty of Perpetual Peace was signed. The price of that peace was the princess herself. Margaret Tudor would be wed to James IV, King of Scotland, a monarch 18 years her senior, who had once led armies against her own people. He was a man seasoned by war and politics, while she was barely old enough to hold a quill steady in her hand. Yet no one asked her opinion. No one asked if she could bear to leave her home, her mother, or the language and music that shaped her childhood. To the Tudors, marriage was duty, not desire. Henry VII had chosen his daughter's future, as he might choose the placement of a soldier on a battlefield. In private, the young princess remained silent. Her face was calm, her posture perfect, but inside, the lesson of her childhood returned to her like a whisper. Survival required understanding the rules and bending them when needed. Scotland would not be her choice, but it could still be her game. She began to prepare, quietly, for the life ahead. While seamstresses measured her for gowns and scholars instructed her in Scottish customs, Margaret spent her evenings listening to her father's advisors talk about the Northern Kingdom. They spoke of clan rivalries, of nobles divided by loyalty and greed, of a court that combined culture and danger in equal measure. To them, Scotland was a chessboard waiting for a clever hand. To Margaret, it was a mystery to be studied. Her mind worked as swiftly as her needle. If she could not refuse the marriage, she could shape what it meant. She told herself she would not be a victim of her father's ambition, nor a prisoner of her husband's crown. She would become a bridge, a living, breathing channel between two worlds that had never trusted each other. But beneath that noble thought, a sharper idea began to form. What if that bridge could serve both ways? What if, by being Queen of Scotland, she could protect her English family's interests as well? She would become her father's eyes and ears in a foreign court, a quiet observer cloaked in silks and ceremony. She would charm her new husband, earn the love of his people, and report everything that mattered back to England. The plan was as daring as it was dangerous. To be both queen and spy, both loyal and treacherous, both beloved and feared. When she shared fragments of this vision with her mother, Elizabeth said nothing. She only looked at her daughter long and hard, as if seeing not a child, but a reflection of the Tudor steel that ran in her veins. Her mother had been born of war, had endured loss, had learned the cost of peace. In that silence, Margaret understood. There would be no rescue. The road north would be hers to walk alone. The months that followed were filled with preparation, each one pulling her further from the life she knew. The royal tailors stitched gowns of crimson and gold, woven with the Tudor rose. Musicians rehearsed the melodies that would accompany her farewell. Priests murmured blessings over her dowry chest, which glittered with coins and gifts meant to impress the Scottish court. Even the servants spoke of the princess with a kind of reverent distance, as though she were already gone. And then came the final decree. In the early summer of the year 1502, the treaty was formally sealed. The betrothal of Margaret Tudor to James IV of Scotland was proclaimed before the English court. The hall fell silent as the young princess, dressed in silver, stepped forward to receive the congratulations of men twice, even 3 times, her age. Her father's expression was one of satisfaction, her mother's eyes full of tears. Margaret curtsied, her movements precise, her face unreadable. Inside, her heart pounded not from fear, but from a strange, gathering resolve. She had been taught all her life to obey, to smile, to play her part, but now she knew that obedience could also be a disguise, and that beneath the still surface of a river, the current always moved. When she looked up, she caught her father's gaze. He believed she was the perfect daughter, docile and dutiful. What he could not see was that she had already made a silent promise to him, to herself, and to the destiny that awaited beyond the northern hills. If she must cross into Scotland, she would do it not as a pawn, but as a player. A bridge, yes, but a bridge that carried secrets in both directions. In the year 1503, the English court glittered beneath summer sunlight as preparations reached their fevered end. The child who had been born in the aftermath of Bosworth was now a bride, bound for a land her ancestors had fought to conquer. 14 years old, Margaret Tudor stood before the long road to Scotland, a road lined with politics, ceremony, and fear. Her departure was a spectacle of grandeur designed to impress both friend and foe. 200 English nobles rode in her procession, their banners painted with lions and roses. Chests of gold and silver, fine fabrics, and jewels followed behind her, guarded by soldiers in polished armour. The dowry Henry VII sent north was immense, not merely wealth, but a declaration that England sought peace through magnificence. Yet amid the clatter of hooves and the hum of voices, Margaret sat silent inside her carriage. The further north she travelled, the heavier the silence grew. Each mile carried her away from the warmth of her mother's presence and deeper into the misty uncertainty of her new life. She had been told stories of Scotland since childhood, tales of rough warriors and barren lands, of kings who ruled by the sword rather than the word. She tried to imagine the face of the man who awaited her at journey's end. James IV, King of Scots, 18 years her senior, a monarch who had once ridden to war against her father's soldiers. How could such a man be her husband? How could such a country ever be her home? The journey north took weeks. Along the way, Scottish nobles came to meet the English bride, their manners strange but not unkind. Some bowed deeply. Others looked on with curiosity, perhaps even suspicion. They had seen English armies before, but never an English princess who came not to conquer but to join their crown. At every stop, Margaret smiled, as she had been taught, serene, graceful, unreadable. But at night, when the noise of the day faded and the fires burned low, she would stare into the darkness and whisper to herself that she would endure, no matter what awaited her beyond the border. When she reached Stirling Castle, her fear met its first surprise. James IV was not what she had been led to expect. He was no barbarian king draped in furs and blood, but a Renaissance monarch educated, eloquent, and deeply curious about the world. Fluent in Latin, versed in philosophy and music, James welcomed his young bride not as a tool of politics, but as a companion to be understood. He spoke to her not as a child, but as an equal, asking her thoughts on art, on God, on the future of peace between their lands. For a girl raised in the shadow of her father's authority, it was an astonishment she could scarcely believe. Their wedding took place at the Church of the Holy Rood in August of that same year. It was one of the most splendid ceremonies Scotland had ever witnessed. Bells rang over the rooftops of Stirling, their echoes blending with the laughter of nobles and the cheers of the gathered crowd. Margaret, dressed in white and gold, walked down the aisle beneath banners, bearing both the Red Lion of Scotland and the Tudor Rose of England. Two enemies joined, at least for a moment, by hope. But it was after the ceremony, in the quiet weeks that followed, that Margaret's life began to change in ways no treaty could predict. At Stirling and later at Edinburgh, she established her own small court, a circle of attendants, scholars and musicians. She began studying the Scots tongue, not as a gesture of diplomacy, but out of genuine curiosity. James's advisers, seeing her interest, allowed her to attend council sessions. There she listened to the fierce debates between Highland and Lowland lords, between merchants and clergy, between loyalty and ambition. Each word became another piece in the great puzzle of rule. Slowly, Margaret began to find her footing. She translated diplomatic letters, wrote responses in both Latin and English, and observed the fragile threads binding Scotland's many factions. She discovered that power was not only about force, but about persuasion, about knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. The girl who had once learned patience at her embroidery frame was now using that same discipline to weave political balance between two uneasy kingdoms. James encouraged her curiosity. He showed her the royal treasury, the fleet at Leith, the new weapons imported from France. He asked her to read and translate dispatches from England, amused by her quick understanding of coded language. And for a time, the unlikely pair, the young bride and the older king, seemed to find a rhythm that neither had expected. But harmony is fragile at courts built on secrets. Not long after she had settled into her role, a courier arrived from the south, bearing letters sealed with the red wax of England. They were written in a familiar hand, her brother's. Henry VIII had ascended the throne, his youth brimming with ambition and suspicion alike. In those letters he asked for information. Details of Scotland's armies, its nobles, its intentions. He wanted numbers, alliances, rumours. He wanted his sister's eyes to serve as his own. Margaret held the letters in trembling hands. The words of her brother were wrapped in affection, but beneath them she could feel the weight of demand. Was she still her father's daughter, or now her husband's queen? The question hollowed the air around her. To betray James would mean destroying the fragile peace she was meant to uphold. To betray Henry would mean defying her own blood. Days passed before she answered. When she did, her response was careful, deliberate, a balance between truth and silence. She described Scotland's growing strength but not its weaknesses, its noble rivalries but not the names. It was a letter meant to warn her brother away from war, without giving him the means to start one. It was a dangerous choice, and it came with a price. England trusted her a little less. Scotland watched her a little more closely. She had placed herself between two crowns, loved by neither, needed by both. And yet, in that precarious space, Margaret Tudor began to understand her own power, not as a queen or a spy, but as something rarer. A woman who could shape the space between nations, one letter at a time. In the year 1512, the long-awaited cry of a newborn echoed through the stone corridors of Holyrood Palace. It was a boy, Prince James, the first legitimate son of King James IV and Queen Margaret Tudor. For Scotland, it was a moment of triumph. For Margaret, it was both a blessing and a chain. The fragile peace between England and Scotland now rested on the tiny shoulders of her child. Almost immediately, the birth became a matter of politics. From London came letters laced with careful warmth. Her brother, King Henry VIII, congratulated her, but beneath his words lingered calculation. The English court hoped that the boy would be raised with affection for England, perhaps even moulded into a future ally, a prince who might one day heal the border through blood and loyalty. But in Edinburgh, the Scottish nobles muttered in warning. They saw in the baby not a symbol of unity, but a potential weapon for English control. The factions within the Scottish court grew restless, their arguments echoing through council chambers while Margaret cradled her infant son, unaware that even his lullabies were political. Margaret, still only 23, understood the danger more clearly than most. To be the mother of a future king was to stand in the crossfire of two worlds. England expected obedience, Scotland demanded independence. So she chose the only path she could, a balance as thin as glass. Publicly, she declared her son the heir of Scotland and vowed he would be raised as a Scottish king. Privately, she maintained quiet contact with the Tudor network across the border, believing that keeping both kingdoms near might one day protect her child. By the year 1513, Margaret had grown into a new role that neither England nor Scotland had foreseen. No longer a mere diplomatic bride, she had become a queen in her own right, a negotiator, a peacemaker, and, at times, the unseen hand behind her husband's decisions. She spoke with ambassadors, reviewed trade proposals, and helped settle quarrels among feuding Highland clans. Her influence was quiet but unmistakable. When James consulted her on questions of policy, her insight reflected the sharp lessons of her father's court. She knew that power depended not on force, but on perception. Yet for all her grace, the world around her darkened with gathering tension. Relations between England and Scotland began to strain once again. Henry VIII, newly crowned and eager to prove himself, sought military glory against France. Scotland, bound by the ancient Old Alliance, was drawn toward France's defence. Every move England made rippled northward. Every word from the English court sounded like the first note of war. Margaret's letters from this time were filled with pleading and restraint. She wrote to her brother in calm, deliberate tones, reminding him that blood had been spilled for centuries, and that peace, once broken, might never return. Her handwriting, steady yet sorrowful, carried the voice of a woman caught between two kings. To the Scottish council, she spoke of prudence, urging them not to be drawn into England's quarrels. She arranged discreet meetings between envoys from both sides, hoping that words could still hold back the storm. But history rarely listens to the voices of peace. In the late summer of that year, Henry marched south toward France, and James, bound by honour, pride, and his treaty with the French, prepared to strike southward into England. Margaret begged him to reconsider. She knelt before him, her son in her arms, reminding him that no war between brothers' lands could bring glory, only widows and orphans. Yet the king's resolve was set. On the 9th day of September, in the year 1513, the Scottish army met the English at Flodden Field. The battle lasted barely 4 hours. When the mist cleared, 10,000 Scots lay dead, their banners trampled into the mud. Among them was King James IV, the last British monarch to die in battle. News of the disaster reached Linlithgow Palace days later. Margaret, still nursing her infant, received the message in stunned silence. Her husband was gone. Her son, barely a year old, was now King James V of Scotland. The young widow faced a realm collapsing under its own grief. English troops threatened to advance north. The nobles, shattered by loss, quarrelled over who should control the new king. France sent envoys offering gold and soldiers, but at the price of turning Scotland into a puppet state. Margaret had only days to decide what kind of queen she would be: a fugitive seeking safety in England, or a ruler standing her ground in a hostile land. She chose to stay. Summoning the remaining nobles to Edinburgh Castle, she appeared before them holding her baby in her arms. The hall was cold, the air thick with smoke and mourning. When she spoke, it was not in the polished English of her birth, but in Scots fluent, measured, resolute. She declared her duty not as an English princess, but as the mother of Scotland's king. The gesture struck the nobles deeply. In that moment, the foreign-born queen became, in their eyes, one of them. They granted her the regency, though not without cruel conditions. She must never remarry without the council's approval. She must keep Scotland free from English interference and refuse domination by France. Bound by these vows, Margaret began one of the most delicate balancing acts in history. For 18 months, she ruled a kingdom bleeding from war, rebuilding its shattered strength while navigating the jealous eyes of every faction around her. She negotiated a temporary truce with her brother Henry, accepting gestures of peace while refusing to bow. She accepted French gold, but carefully avoided the chains that came with it. She soothed the rival clans, persuading them to unite around her infant son rather than tear the realm apart. Her leadership, quiet but unyielding, brought Scotland back from the edge. Yet even as she performed miracles in politics, her private life frayed beneath the weight of loneliness. Nights in Edinburgh grew longer and colder. Letters from England were few and distant. Whispers in the Scottish court grew louder, questioning her strength, her faith, her motives. The woman who had once been the bridge between two kingdoms was now forced to stand alone upon it, trembling beneath the strain. And just as she began to steady herself, another figure entered her life, young, handsome, and ambitious. A man whose name would soon be bound to hers in a decision that would undo everything she had built. A door was opening, the door of love, and behind it waited her greatest downfall. In the cold months that followed the death of King James IV, Queen Margaret found herself surrounded not by comfort, but by vultures disguised as courtiers. Power, like the scent of blood, drew men closer. She was 24, too young to rule a kingdom alone, too young to be a widow, and far too valuable to be left unguarded. The nobles who had once bowed to her as regent now whispered in corners, each plotting how best to use her grief to their advantage. Some sought her hand in marriage to claim the regency through her. Others, more ruthless, schemed to seize her person outright, to trade the Queen's captivity for political favour. In this tightening circle of danger appeared Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus. He was 25, tall, golden-haired, and charming, the kind of man who spoke softly enough to make ambition sound like affection. He came from the Douglas clan, the second most powerful family in Scotland, a name that carried both prestige and peril. His words were honeyed with poetry, his eyes bright with sympathy. To a queen weary of mourning, he seemed less like a politician and more like a saviour. He promised to protect her from the nobles who circled her throne like wolves. He promised safety, partnership, perhaps even love. In August of the year 1514, Margaret Tudor made her choice. Against the advice of her council, against every warning echoing through the halls of Edinburgh, she married Archibald Douglas in secret at Kinneil Church. The ceremony was small, hurried, hidden beneath the pretence of mourning. To Margaret, it was a union of hearts, a moment of human warmth after 2 years of ice. To the rest of Scotland, it was treason against political balance. For centuries, The Douglases had been accused of ambition that reached beyond loyalty. Their family had long sought control over the crown through cunning marriages and quiet manipulations. Now, with Margaret's hand, they held the regency in their grasp. Within weeks, her name was no longer spoken with reverence, but suspicion. The same council that had once trusted her to govern a shattered kingdom convened again in outrage. Their verdict was swift and brutal. Margaret's regency was stripped away. Her authority over her infant son, King James V, was suspended. The nobles sent for John Stuart, Duke of Albany, a man who had lived his entire life in France and could scarcely speak Scots. He was to be the new regent, ruling on behalf of the young king. All of Margaret's delicate diplomacy, her truce with England, her efforts to rebuild Scotland's unity, all were erased in a matter of weeks. The punishment did not stop there. In England, her brother Henry VIII, who had once praised her as a model of Tudor intelligence, reacted with fury. He declared her marriage a disgrace to the royal bloodline and an insult to their family's dignity. He immediately cut off her English pension, the very funds that had supported her court and her son's household. A Tudor queen, he is said to have remarked bitterly, has thrown herself into the arms of those who would use her crown for their own. His words, sent north through envoys, reached her like a blade. Margaret's isolation deepened. Stripped of regency, deprived of income, she found herself dependent on the very man she had married for freedom. And Archibald Douglas, once gentle and adoring, began to change. The protector became the controller. He took charge of her correspondence, deciding which letters would be read and which would be burned. He surrounded her with his family's retainers, men who reported not to their queen, but to their earl. Her palace became a cage, its doors guarded by those who claimed to love her. He used her name to sign documents that favoured his own clan, made agreements without her consent, and whispered to others that he was acting on behalf of the Queen. Slowly, Margaret realised that her husband's affection had never been separate from ambition. His promises of safety had been the gentlest form of conquest. Outside the palace, her reputation crumbled. To the Scottish nobles, she was no longer the wise regent who had once held the kingdom together, but a reckless woman undone by emotion. The chroniclers wrote that she had traded power for passion. In the council chambers, her name was invoked only as a warning, a reminder that women who stepped beyond obedience would be punished not for their weakness, but for their strength. Margaret tried to write to Henry, begging for understanding. Her letters, filled with sorrow, crossed the border but found no mercy. Her brother's answer was cold. She had broken the Tudor code. Loyalty to family came before love, before freedom, before self. She had failed that creed, and for that she would receive no aid. By the spring of the year 1515, she had lost everything that once defined her. Her throne, her allies, her wealth, her reputation. Only her child remained, and even he was slipping beyond her reach, surrounded by nobles who sought to mould him against her influence. The young king's guardians now reported directly to Albany, who ruled from afar through letters sealed in French wax. In her chambers, Margaret began to understand the bitter symmetry of her life. She had once been the bridge between two kingdoms, balancing love and duty, blood and crown. Now, she was a bridge burned from both ends, despised in Scotland, disowned in England, and trapped between a husband who used her name and a brother who refused to speak it. When she walked through the corridors of Holyrood, the servants no longer bowed as deeply. They averted their eyes. Her silks had faded. Her voice, once commanding, carried the weight of exhaustion. Yet behind the quiet dignity of her gaze, something remained unbroken. The same Tudor fire that had carried her father through exile, her grandmother through rebellion, and her brother through ambition. She had lost control of the game, but she had not forgotten how it was played. And though she did not yet know it, the next move, one born of desperation, would set the course for her downfall and her eventual redemption. Archibald Douglas, the man who had once sworn to protect her, soon revealed the true face of his power. His charm, once soft as silk, hardened into command. Within months of their marriage, the Earl of Angus had seized control over every aspect of Margaret's existence. He read her letters before she did, decided which messages she might send, and which should be destroyed. No word left her chambers without his seal. Her friends were turned away from the gates. Those who dared to visit her were quietly threatened or bought off. The Queen, who had once ruled councils, now needed permission to speak. Under the pretense of safeguarding the royal widow, Angus began using her name to advance the ambitions of his family. He negotiated alliances, claimed estates, and made political bargains, all signed in the name of Margaret, Queen of Scots. The woman who had once balanced kingdoms was now reduced to a signature, a tool wielded by the very man she had married for freedom. By the year 1516, Margaret could no longer bear the humiliation. The palace that had once echoed with her laughter had turned into a prison of marble and silence. Servants loyal to Angus followed her every step. Even her correspondence with her young son, King James V, was censored. The husband who had promised to guard her from the world had instead locked her away from it. That same year, Margaret made a decision that would mark the turning point of her life. She petitioned the church to annul her marriage to Archibald Douglas. It was a desperate act, one born not of rebellion, but of survival. Her plea was clear. The marriage had been conducted without proper consent, under manipulation, and had endangered both her and her son's position. But in a world ruled by men, a queen's suffering was no argument at all. Her appeal was met with silence from both thrones. In England, her brother Henry VIII was unmoved. He called her a foolish woman led astray by passion, refusing any aid or political protection. For him, Margaret's failures were an embarrassment, a reflection of Tudor weakness. In Scotland, the nobles laughed at her request. To them, the Queen had broken every rule of decorum and loyalty. She had married for love when she was bound by duty, and now sought to escape the consequences of her own heart. To ask for sympathy was, in their eyes, proof that she no longer deserved respect, and so both crowns turned away. Margaret found herself trapped in the narrow space between pity and contempt. Those who had once celebrated her intelligence now called her unstable. Those who had praised her diplomacy now accused her of deceit. Even her closest allies began to withdraw, fearful that her downfall might stain their names. It was in those lonely months that Margaret began to see the cruel truth that had always been hidden beneath the surface of royal life. Women could be wise, but not too wise. Powerful, but only under supervision. The moment a woman thought beyond the limits prescribed for her, the moment she acted for herself, she became dangerous. She thought of her grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, who had built the Tudor dynasty through cunning and faith, but had ruled only from behind curtains and counsel. She thought of her mother, Elizabeth of York, whose quiet grace had hidden a lifetime of compromise. And now, here she was, their descendant, a woman who had dared to think she could wield power openly. Her punishment was swift and thorough. Angus tightened his hold. He forbade her to leave Edinburgh without his consent. He took possession of her jewels, her correspondence, even her servants. Her few remaining supporters were dismissed or replaced by Douglas loyalists. The Queen, who had once commanded armies, was now escorted by guards wherever she went. Rumours spread that she had gone mad. At court, men debated her fate as though she were an abstract idea, not a living person. Some said she should be sent to a convent. Others whispered she might flee to England, though Henry would not receive her. No one mentioned rescue. In private, Margaret wrote again to her brother one last plea. Her handwriting trembled, but her words were precise. I am a prisoner in my own house, denied all counsel and comfort. I have served peace, and yet I live without it. The message crossed the border but received no reply. By the winter of that same year, even the weather seemed to conspire against her. The winds from the North Sea howled against the palace walls, and the hearths burned low. She spent long evenings seated by the fire, staring into the flames as if they might show her what future remained. She was still queen by title, but her crown had become invisible. Once, she had been the bridge between England and Scotland. Now, she was a relic of a peace no one cared to remember. Her greatest strength, her independence, had turned into the reason for her ruin. The more she tried to reclaim her dignity, the more the world insisted on stripping it away. In that quiet defeat, Margaret understood the full cruelty of her station. She could neither live as a queen nor escape as a woman. The men around her, her brother, her husband, her council, saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be contained. Yet deep within that silence, something stubborn remained. Each night, as she extinguished the last candle, she whispered to herself that no cage was eternal. Her father's crown had been won from exile. Her family's fortune had been rebuilt from ruin. And though she now seemed a discarded pawn on the chessboard of two kingdoms, Margaret Tudor still carried within her the restless mind of a player. For now, she endured watching, waiting, learning once again the lesson that had defined her life. That even when stripped of everything, knowledge was power, and silence could still be sharpened into a weapon. By the year 1517, Margaret Tudor's world had narrowed to a fragile silence. Her influence, once vast and subtle, had collapsed completely. She had been a queen, a regent, a bridge between nations. Now she was a woman surrounded by walls and whispers. Her enemies did not need to imprison her. They had already taken what mattered more, her credibility. No faction in Scotland dared to defend her. To the nobles, she was too unpredictable, too intelligent, and far too entangled with foreign powers. To them, loyalty was a currency, and Margaret had spent hers long ago. The French, who once courted her as a useful ally, quietly withdrew their envoys, turning instead toward the new regent, John Stuart, Duke of Albany. Even France, which had celebrated her defiance, now considered her independence too volatile to trust. Across the border, her brother Henry VIII played his own cruel game. He offered no open hostility, only silence, which cut deeper. In private, he encouraged Scottish lords who opposed his sister, feeding their ambitions while pretending ignorance. To his council, he called her unsteady and over-proud, as though her downfall were a moral failing rather than the inevitable punishment for daring to think for herself. Her so-called crime was not treason, nor corruption, nor neglect. It was far simpler and far more unforgivable. She had proven that a royal woman could possess both mind and will. In a world where queens were meant to embody obedience, Margaret's defiance became a heresy. She had chosen her own path, spoken her own words, loved on her own terms, and for that, the world had no place for her. The courts of Europe had no shortage of clever women, but most learned to mask their brilliance behind smiles and silence. Margaret had not. She had governed as a man would, and now she paid a man's price, without a man's protection. The isolation pressed on her like a slow winter. Her letters went unanswered. Her messengers vanished between castles and borders. Even her son, King James V, still a child under the care of rival factions, was kept from her. She longed to hold him, to tell him that power was never safe, that crowns were always heavier for those who wore them alone. But she could only write his name in her journal, James, mine by blood, but not by heart. Her health began to falter. The years of political strain, grief and fear carved lines into her face, though she was barely 28. Yet her spirit, the sharp, calculating mind that had once impressed her father and unsettled her husband, refused to yield. She continued to write. Each letter was an act of rebellion, slow, deliberate, and dangerous. She wrote to ambassadors in France, to merchants in Flanders, to diplomats who had once served at her father's court. Her handwriting, elegant and controlled, carried both desperation and determination. She sought alliances where there were none left, urging for mediation, for recognition, for remembrance. She appealed to conscience, to blood, to history. Most letters brought no answer. A few brought sympathy, but sympathy did not feed armies or silence enemies. What exhausted her most was not failure, but betrayal, the quiet, steady erosion of trust. The brother who had once promised to protect her now used her name to justify his meddling in Scotland. The husband who had vowed to keep her safe had turned her into a shield for his ambition. Even the crown she had worn with such pride now felt like a cruel reminder of how little freedom it offered. She was learning again what she had known since childhood, that love and loyalty in royal courts were luxuries, not virtues. Everything could be bought, traded, or forgotten, even family. At night, Margaret would sit by the narrow window of her chamber in Edinburgh, staring out over the city she had once ruled. The lights of the houses below flickered like distant stars, unreachable and uncaring. The wind from the north carried the chill of the sea and the faint tolling of the cathedral bells. She would close her eyes and imagine England the warmth of her mother's arms, the sound of the Thames, the scent of roses in the gardens of Richmond. But England was as far away as Mercy. There were moments when she considered escape. Some said she even planned it a secret flight to the English border to plead her case directly to Henry. But each plan collapsed under the same truth. She had nowhere to go. She was too English for the Scots, too Scottish for the English, and too dangerous for both. Still, she refused to disappear quietly. She began to keep a private record, fragments of thought, reflections on politics, on faith, on the strange fragility of power. "Men speak of crowns," she wrote once, "as though they are gold. But crowns are made of thorns." It was not self-pity that drove her pen, but clarity. She knew her story would be told by others men who would reduce her to rumour, mistake or warning. So she left behind her own account, a quiet defence for a future she would never see. Margaret understood now that history would not forgive her independence. It would paint her as reckless, proud, unstable. But she also understood something greater, that her defiance had meaning beyond her lifetime. She had broken a pattern older than her dynasty, older even than her crown. She had proven that a queen could think as sharply as a king, that love and reason could coexist in one heart, that silence was not the only virtue left to women. And though the world called her fallen, she did not see herself as defeated. "A bridge," she whispered once to her maid, "burns only when both sides set fire." In the dim light of that year, 1517, Margaret Tudor stood alone, misunderstood and nearly forgotten. But beneath the sorrow, beneath the betrayals and the loss, a pulse of quiet defiance still beat within her. The world had stripped her of everything but her mind, and that, she knew, was enough to begin again. By the year 1518, every door had closed. The corridors that had once echoed with Margaret Tudor's footsteps now carried only the whisper of her name, a name spoken cautiously, like a memory that people wished to forget. Her power, her dignity, even her motherhood had been stripped from her piece by piece, until all that remained was the ghost of a queen no longer allowed to rule, to speak, or even to love. Her son, King James V, was only 7 years old. The boy who had once clutched at her fingers and laughed beneath the vaulted ceilings of Linlithgow Palace was now a ward of the very nobles who had destroyed her regency. They kept him surrounded by guards, tutors, and whispers that painted his mother as a traitor, a spy in service to England. They told him that she had betrayed his father's memory, that she had endangered the crown, that her love was poison. Slowly, the distance between mother and child became wider than the sea itself. Margaret's letters to her son never reached him. They were intercepted, opened, burned. In the boy's mind, her face began to blur into the tales his guardians fed him. Not the warm voice that had once sung him to sleep, but the shadow of a dangerous woman who could not be trusted. To the young king, his mother had become an absence, defined only by what others said of her. Henry VIII's message arrived that same year, cold and transactional. He would allow her to return to England, he said, but only under conditions that erased everything she had ever been. She must renounce all political influence in Scotland, give up her claim as regent, and swear never again to interfere in affairs of the crown. In return, she would be granted safety, a small estate, and silence. It was an offer disguised as mercy. The Scottish Council sent an equally cruel reply. She could remain in Scotland, they said, but only as a powerless widow, stripped of any voice or estate. She would be tolerated, not respected, permitted to exist, but not to act. Her life, whichever side she chose, would be a form of exile. In these negotiations between men and monarchs, Margaret herself had become nothing more than a bargaining chip a woman used to test the boundaries of diplomacy. They no longer spoke of her as a person, only as a problem to be contained. Her marriage to Archibald Douglas had long since turned into a living cage. He had learned to wield her name like a weapon, trading upon it to secure his own power. To the outside world, he was still the husband of the Queen, a title that carried weight, even as it crushed her. Within the walls of their castle, she was a prisoner. Her correspondence was monitored, her visitors screened, her every movement shadowed. Sometimes she would stand by the window, watching the horizon fade beneath the Scottish rain, and think of freedom as a story told to other people. The courtyards below were filled with guards loyal to Douglas. Even the maids who brushed her hair were instructed to report her moods. She was the queen of a silence she could not escape. She tried at first to fight it. She wrote to Henry again, appealing to the brother she had once comforted in childhood. Her words were measured, sorrowful, pleading, "I have been made a stranger in both lands. You know what I have given for peace. Do not let me end in disgrace." There was no reply. The silence from England was not ignorance. It was choice. Henry had built his reign on control, and his sister's defiance had become an embarrassment. A woman who had once outwitted ambassadors, guided armies, and balanced two crowns was now a reminder of what the Tudors feared most, a queen who could think for herself. Margaret's days began to dissolve into sameness. The hours were marked only by the toll of church bells and the soft scrape of parchment as she wrote letters no one would read. Her jewellery, once symbols of her rank, was gone sold or seized. Her gowns, once embroidered in gold, were now simple wool. Even the servants who pitied her avoided her gaze, afraid of being caught in her misfortune. At night, when sleep refused her, she would remember the sound of wedding bells at the Church of the Holy Rood, the scent of roses at her coronation, the laughter of her son before the world taught him to fear her. And she would think of how strange it was that a single life could hold both splendour and despair in equal measure, how the same woman who had stopped a war now begged merely to live in peace. Her isolation was not just physical. It was the slow erasure of identity. Without her throne, her child, or her voice, she had become invisible to the very world she had once shaped. To England, she was a failure. To Scotland, an inconvenience. To Douglas, a possession. And yet, in that hollow existence, something stubborn flickered still the last ember of the spirit that had defied her brother, her enemies, and her fate. Even when reduced to begging for an allowance from the same man who had denied her comfort, she refused to yield completely. Her final letters from that period are written in a hand both weary and resolute. In them she no longer spoke of glory or politics. She wrote, instead of dignity, a word more fragile than power, but infinitely harder to destroy. "They have taken all that can be held," she wrote, "but what is thought cannot be seized." By the end of that year, the once mighty Queen of Scotland lived like a ghost among the ruins of her own story. Those who saw her pass through the corridors of VIII Castle described her as pale, quiet, and watchful, the kind of silence that comes not from weakness, but from having seen too much. The woman who had once commanded the fate of nations now lived on the charity of others, her letters unanswered, her name slowly fading from court. But even as the world forgot her, Margaret Tudor was not entirely gone. Beneath the ashes of her former life, a quiet endurance endured the same strength that had carried her from the gilded halls of England to the wild storms of Scotland. She had lost her kingdom, her marriage, her family, but she had not yet lost herself. And in that small, flickering truth, there still lived a trace of the queen she had once been. Margaret Tudor had once done the unthinkable. She had ruled, negotiated, and held a kingdom together while the men around her destroyed theirs. But medieval Europe was not ready for such defiance. In the world she inhabited, a woman's brilliance was admired only until it threatened to outshine a man's. And so, they did not punish her for failing, they punished her for succeeding. The chroniclers would later write her name with a warning, not an honour. She became a lesson whispered in royal courts across Europe. Let queens be beautiful, pious, and silent, not clever, not independent, not dangerous. Her story was turned into caution, her triumph into shame. What she had built through intelligence and courage was erased by the ink of men who feared what her memory could inspire. And yet, in the shadows of her obscurity, Margaret Tudor still moved quietly, not to reclaim her throne, but to plant something deeper, something the world could not uproot. She understood now that her era would never allow her to win, but perhaps another generation could. What she could not achieve through treaties or crowns, she would pass on through blood, a lineage that might someday finish what she had begun. By the winter of the year 1527, the queen who had once commanded armies became a fugitive from her own marriage. After years of humiliation and control, she finally broke free from Archibald Douglas. The escape was perilous. The roads were watched, her name still bound to his. But one cold morning, beneath a sky the colour of ash, she fled VIII Castle, leaving behind the life that had long ceased to be hers. In her flight, she found something she had not known in years ere that tasted of freedom. And, along that uncertain path, she met Henry Stuart. He was 6 years younger, a courtier of modest birth but of quiet dignity. He did not come to her with titles or ambitions, only with a gentleness that disarmed her. Henry treated her not as a symbol or a prize, but as a woman, a soul scarred but still alive. His kindness was not gilded with politics. For the first time since her youth, Margaret was seen, not used. Their union was not one of power, but of peace. In the eyes of the court, it was scandalous. In the heart of Margaret, it was salvation. They married that same year, not in grandeur, but in stillness. No armies, no treaties, no dowries. Just two people defying the world's rules for one brief, honest moment. In Henry Stuart's arms, she rediscovered fragments of herself, long thought, lost, laughter, trust, and the fragile courage to hope again. He listened to her memories, her regrets, her endless calculations of what might have been. He did not interrupt. He simply stayed. To a woman who had been treated all her life as a weapon, a pawn, a cautionary tale, that patience was a revolution greater than any crown. But time, as ever, was unkind. The world had moved on without her. Her reputation was in ruins. Her name carried the weight of scandal rather than sovereignty. Even those who pitied her refused to risk their own fortunes for her cause. The English court ignored her entirely. In Scotland, the regency had long passed to others who ruled in her son's name. Margaret lived quietly at Methven Castle once again, this time not as a prisoner, but as a relic. The rooms were colder now, the servants fewer. Her days passed in a rhythm of silence, mending her own dresses, tending small gardens, writing letters to no one. The woman who had once been the axis between two kingdoms now lived a life measured by the turning of seasons. And yet, she never surrendered the mind that had shaped her fate. Her letters from this period reveal a melancholy wisdom, the kind that comes not from bitterness, but from understanding the price of vision. "I have learned," she wrote, "that crowns may be won with courage, but kept only with fear. I would not wish such a prize upon any daughter of mine." It was a confession and a prophecy, for in her bloodline, the seed she had sown would one day bloom, though she would never live to see it. As the years wore on, her health began to fade. The winters in Perthshire were long and unkind. Henry Stuart remained by her side, loyal and steadfast. Together they lived not as monarchs, but as survivors, two souls bound by quiet endurance. Her son, King James V, now grown, ruled Scotland with the same fire she had once shown, though he seldom acknowledged the mother who had given him both his throne and his caution. Occasionally, he sent her small sums of money, gestures more of obligation than affection. The boy who had been taught to fear her now pitied her, and perhaps that was the cruelest mercy of all. In the final years of her life, Margaret Tudor found peace, not in forgiveness, but in clarity. She had seen the full circle of power, its seduction, its corruption, its loneliness, and she had learned that to rule is to be devoured slowly by expectation. When she walked through the corridors of Methven for the last time, her steps were slow, but her head remained high. There were no courtiers left to bow, no heralds to announce her presence, but the dignity that had once guided nations still clung to her like a quiet flame. She died in October of the year 1541, at the age of 51. There was no royal funeral, no grand mourning, no parades of loyalty. History moved forward without looking back. The chronicles recorded her name briefly, a sister of Henry VIII, a Queen of Scotland, a woman of trouble. But they missed what mattered, for though the world had erased her victories, it could not erase their consequence. Her great-grandson, James VI of Scotland, born of her blood, would one day inherit both the Scottish and English thrones. In the year 1603, uniting the two kingdoms, she had spent her life trying to reconcile. The woman they had called a failure had, in truth, secured history's final triumph. And so, as the candlelight of her story faded, one truth remained. Margaret Tudor, the queen forgotten by time, had changed the shape of it forever, not through conquest, but through endurance. After years of struggling against the currents of fate, Margaret Tudor withdrew at last to Methven Castle, a modest stronghold in Perthshire, grey and quiet against the winds of the north. Once, its walls had rung with the voices of courtiers and the laughter of servants. Now they stood still, the echo of power long faded. It was here that people began to call it the refuge of the woman forgotten by history. The queen who had once worn cloth of gold now dressed herself in patched gowns of wool. The jewels that had once adorned her crown were long sold to pay debts and keep the fires burning. Each morning, She mended her own sleeves by the narrow light that crept through the small window panes. The same hands that had once sealed treaties and signed royal decrees now trembled slightly as they drew the needle through coarse fabric. The days passed quietly, one bleeding into another. There were no banquets, no ceremonies, no trumpets announcing her name. Only the sigh of the wind through the corridors, the distant toll of a chapel bell, and the soft crackle of the hearth. Sometimes she would walk through the overgrown gardens, her steps slow, her mind lost in the haze of memory, remembering not glory, but faces. Her father's grave, strategic smile, her mother's gentle patience, her brother's laughter before ambition hardened it into cruelty. Her only son, King James V, now ruled Scotland. He was 26, strong and proud, a monarch in every sense. But though his blood came from her, his affection did not. The years of propaganda had done their work. He saw her not as the woman who had safeguarded his throne in infancy, but as the cause of past instability. Sometimes a messenger would arrive from Edinburgh with a small purse of coins, a gesture of duty, not love. No letter ever accompanied the money. No visit ever followed. The distance between mother and son was a wound that never healed. To the people of Scotland, she had become a fading echo of another age. The nobles who once feared her sharp intelligence now regarded her as harmless, a relic from the days when queens dared to rule. In England, her name was rarely spoken at all. At Henry VIII's court, no one mentioned the sister who had once stood as England's bridge to the north. To acknowledge her was to remember her defiance, and Henry had long since learned to bury what unsettled him. And yet, within the stillness of Methven, Margaret Tudor refused to let her spirit die. Her body was frail, her position erased, but the will that had once moved two kingdoms still flickered inside her. She spent long hours writing, not to plead, not to demand, but to remember. The pages of her letters and journals, still bearing the elegant Tudor hand, were filled with reflections rather than regrets. "I have seen peace born in blood," she wrote once, "and thrones kept by fear. The years have taught me that power is not the crown but the endurance to wear it." Sometimes she would look out through the narrow castle windows toward the horizon, to the north, where her son ruled, to the south, where her brother's realm lay beyond the border. Between them stretched the same cold line of land and suspicion that she had spent her entire life trying to bridge. And yet, despite everything, a small ember of hope endured within her heart. She believed that her lineage, her blood, her struggle would one day unite the very nations that had torn her apart. She could not know when or how, but she felt it with the same quiet certainty that had once guided her through the treacherous courts of Europe. She often spoke softly to her attendants, as if telling a bedtime story, of a future where no border divided England and Scotland, where a single crown would rest upon the head of one ruler. Her servants, out of respect or pity, listened in silence. Perhaps they thought her imagination had drifted into fancy, but Margaret knew what they could, not that the past had a way of bending toward completion, and that her suffering had not been for nothing. Her health declined slowly. The winters at Methven were cruel, the air damp and biting. On the coldest nights, when the frost gathered on the inside of the glass and her breath hung like smoke in the air, she would sit close to the fire, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. The candle beside her burned low, its flame trembling in the draught. The sound of her needle-stitching fabric was the only rhythm in the room. It was steady, patient, a heartbeat against the silence. Each thread she pulled seemed to tie her a little more firmly to the world, as though by the act of mending small things, she could still keep the greater world from unraveling completely. She no longer spoke of politics or war. Those battles had been fought and lost. What remained was something quieter, the belief that endurance itself was a kind of triumph, that to have survived betrayal, exile, and humiliation without surrendering the self was victory enough. On some evenings, when the sunset bled across the fields in red and gold, Margaret would whisper to herself the names of those who had come before her: her father, Henry VII, her mother Elizabeth of York, her brother Henry VIII, and then, finally, her own. It was not vanity but remembrance, a small act of reclaiming what history had taken. And though Scotland had long forgotten her, and England pretended she had never existed, She continued to believe that one day her story would return. When she closed her eyes at night, she often dreamed of two banners, the Red Lion of Scotland and the Tudor Rose of England, drifting closer and closer until they merged into one. She would smile faintly in her sleep, as though hearing distant bells ring in a land yet to come. And perhaps in those quiet hours, she could already see what the world would only realize many decades later, that her bloodline, carried through time, would do what her heart had always longed for, that in the year 1603, her great-grandson James VI of Scotland would ascend to the English throne as James I, uniting the crowns that had once divided her soul. But for now, she waited patient, forgotten, and unbroken, the candlelight flickering gently across her face. The queen who had lost everything yet somehow planted the seed of eternity. In the year 1541, the story of Margaret Tudor came to its quiet end. She was 51 years old when death finally reached her, not as an enemy, but as an old companion who had walked beside her for years. There was no court physician by her bed, no royal herald waiting to proclaim her passing. The woman who had once been the heartbeat of two kingdoms slipped away in near silence, her breath fading with the dimming of a single candle. There was no royal funeral, no procession winding through the streets of Edinburgh. No bells rang across Scotland to mourn the sister of England's king. Only a few faithful servants stood by her side, their eyes wet and their hands shaking as they prepared her modest resting place. In those final hours, no noble emissary came to speak of her legacy. No bishop offered elaborate prayers. She was buried quietly, without fanfare, in the Carthusian Abbey at Perth. The air was cold, the ceremony brief. From England, there was nothing. No message of condolence, no acknowledgement that the Tudor bloodline had lost one of its earliest branches. Henry VIII, long consumed by his own ambitions and wives, made no mention of her in court. His silence was as final as her death. From Scotland, only a token response arrived. King James V, her son, sent a small sum of money for the burial, not out of love, but obligation. He did not attend, nor did he send a delegation of his lords. The same child she had once held as armies closed in, the same boy for whom she had sacrificed her crown, now kept his distance. Perhaps the years of mistrust could not be undone. Perhaps the image of his mother as the English spy had hardened beyond repair. And so, Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII, sister of Henry VIII, mother of James V, left the world as she had lived it, alone between two crowns. The winds of November carried no songs for her, only the rustle of leaves across an unmarked grave. The world turned, and history, indifferent and impatient, moved on. It was as if she had never existed. But time has its own way of remembering. The same centuries that erased her name from chronicles would one day restore it in whispers of fate. For the quiet soil that covered her in the year 1541 held a seed planted by blood, and will a seed that would take 62 years to bloom. In the spring of the year 1603, Scotland and England stood once again on the brink of uncertainty. Queen Elizabeth I of England, the last of Henry VIII's line, had died without an heir. The Tudor dynasty, born from war, built on ambition, and baptized in blood, seemed destined to end. But history, like a tide, returned to the shore Margaret had once dreamed of reaching. Her great-grandson, James VI of Scotland, ascended the English throne as James I. For the first time, the crowns of England and Scotland rested upon a single head. Two nations, divided for centuries by hatred and betrayal, were bound together under one rule. The unification Margaret had envisioned in the depths of her exile, the peace she had begged for in letters no one answered, had at last become real. The irony was as profound as it was poetic. The woman branded a traitor to both realms became, through lineage, the architect of their unity. The breaker of peace, as her critics had called her, was revealed by time to be the very mother of peace. The two nations that had once despised her name now lived under the enduring stability she had fought, wept, and bled to secure. None of it bore her signature. There were no monuments raised in her honor, no histories proclaiming her triumph. Her victory came not through decrees or armies, but through inheritance, through the quiet persistence of her blood. If the stones of Methven Castle could speak, they might have told of those nights when Margaret, alone before the fire, had whispered her prophecy to the dark, that one day her son's descendants would unite the lands that had torn her apart. And so it came to pass. The unification of the crowns under James VI and I was more than a political accident. It was the closing of a circle that had begun with her. The bridge she had tried to build in life, shattered by war and pride, was finally complete in death. The peace she could not live to see became her final legacy. Historians would later write of kings and treaties, of power and conquest. Few would write of her, but those who looked closely enough, those who traced the veins of history beneath the surface, would find her there, silent but present, the invisible thread that stitched two nations into one. In the quiet of Perthshire, her grave remained unadorned, the name on her stone weathered almost to nothing. Yet her presence lived on in every royal seal that bore both the Rose of England and the Lion of Scotland, in every law passed under a united crown, in every child born to a land no longer divided by its borders. Margaret Tudor's life had been marked by storms, but her legacy endured like calm after thunder. She had lost her power, her crown, her voice, but not her purpose. In the end, she proved that some victories are not shouted from thrones or celebrated by armies. Some are quiet, patient, and eternal. And so, while the world forgot the woman, it could never escape the consequence of her existence. The blood that once flowed through the daughter of Henry VII would shape the destiny of Britain itself. History, at last, kept her promise, the promise she had whispered to the wind from the lonely towers of Methven. Someday, peace will wear my name, even if the world forgets my face. When history looks back, Margaret Tudor no longer appears as a tragic figure, but as a mirror of an age that was not yet ready for women who could think. She was the first of the Tudor bloodline to love not by decree, but by desire, to choose not duty, but the heart. In an era when obedience was considered a woman's only virtue, her refusal to submit became her rebellion. And though it cost her her crown, her reputation, and her peace, it also carved her name faintly but indelibly into the conscience of history. She had lived in a world where men held the pen, the sword, and the crown. Kings decided the fates of queens. Fathers arranged the futures of daughters. A woman could be worshipped or feared, but never free. Yet Margaret Tudor defied every rule they wrote for her. She thought as they did, spoke as they did, ruled as they did, and for that they punished her as they never would have punished one of their own. The court chroniclers of her time called her impulsive, vain, even dangerous. But beneath their ink lies a quieter truth. Margaret was punished not because she failed to rule well, but because she ruled at all. She negotiated truces that men later took credit for. She held a kingdom together when most believed it would fall apart. She did not wage war, but she understood how peace was made and how fragile it was in the hands of those who treated it as a game. Her life was not a tale of missteps, but of limits, the invisible walls built around women, even queens. When she crossed them, she was condemned. When she stayed within them, she was ignored. But in crossing them, she changed what those walls meant. In loving freely, she defied the notion that royal women existed only as contracts of alliance. In leading a nation after Flodden, she proved that courage was not the privilege of kings. And in surviving betrayal, humiliation, and exile without surrendering her mind, she showed that dignity could live even when power was gone. The world she inhabited had no language for such defiance. They called it folly, arrogance, disobedience, anything but what it truly was: independence. And so she was erased, her victories buried beneath her supposed flaws. Yet, paradoxically, it was that very erasure that preserved her legacy. For what is forgotten in one century often returns in another, clearer and sharper than before. The lessons of her life lingered long after her death. The queens who came after her, Mary Tudor, Elizabeth I, Mary Stuart, each carried echoes of Margaret's defiance. Some learned from her mistakes, others inherited her strength. Every woman who dared to rule in her own right, every queen who demanded to be seen as more than a bride, stood in the shadow of Margaret's first rebellion. She had paid for that rebellion with loneliness. Power had isolated her, love had betrayed her, family had abandoned her. But even in her solitude, she remained unbroken. The letters she wrote, the choices she made, the risks she took, all bore the same quiet message. that a woman's will, once awakened, could not be silenced again. It is easy, centuries later, to see her story as inevitable, to look at her triumph through the lens of time and call it destiny. But for Margaret, there was nothing inevitable about survival. Every decision she made was a battle. Every act of thought, an act of defiance. In her world, silence was safety, and she chose to speak. Submission was survival, and she chose to act. Perhaps that is why she lingers in history, not as a saint, nor as a villain, but as something rarer, a reminder of what it costs to be the first. The first to love on one's own terms. The first to rule without permission. The first to believe that a woman's mind was as valuable as her bloodline. Margaret's life was proof that courage and consequence are born together. She had no monuments, no statues, no grand tombs carved in her honor. But her monument was made of something stronger than stone. It was built in the lineage that followed her, in the union of two kingdoms, and in every woman who dared to remember her not as a failure, but as a beginning. For history too eventually learns. The same world that once silenced her now repeats her story as a lesson. It tells of a queen who was too proud to obey, too passionate to conform, and too human to be forgotten. Margaret Tudor's name may not be spoken with the same reverence as her brothers or her sons, but her legacy runs deeper than either. She taught power the meaning of conscience, and history the meaning of patience. And so, when the wind sweeps across the quiet fields of Perthshire where she lies, one can almost hear it, the faint murmur of a woman who lived too early for her time, but exactly in time for what the future would need. Margaret Tudor, the queen who dared to think, who loved beyond law, who paid with solitude for freedom, remains, even now, a silent spark in the long, dark corridors of royal history. She proved what few in her age could bear to believe, that thought itself, once kindled in a woman's mind, can outlast any crown. If Henry VIII embodied the ruthless force of masculine power, then Margaret Tudor stood as its quiet reflection, reason and emotion entwined, a figure who understood that true peace could never be born from conquest, but only from comprehension. Where her brother ruled through fear, she ruled through persuasion. Where he built empires from broken vows, she tried to mend them with words and will. Theirs was the eternal conflict of their age, the sword against the heart, authority against understanding. Margaret had once been called the bridge between England and Scotland, and though that bridge was eventually set ablaze by war and betrayal, its ashes became the foundation of something far greater, the unity that would one day bind the two nations she had spent her life trying to reconcile. History, in its slow and merciless way, proved that the structure she built from her own ruin had not collapsed in vain. Her love, so often dismissed as folly, was the invisible thread that stitched her story into the broader tapestry of history. It was love that first made her a peacemaker, love that turned her into a traitor, love that ultimately saved the realm she once endangered. She had loved as both queen and woman, not with the romantic naivety of youth, but with the full knowledge of what it would cost her. Every decision she made carried the echo of consequence, yet she never stopped choosing. When she defied her brother, it was not rebellion but compassion, the belief that two nations tied by blood need not be enemies. When she risked her throne for marriage, it was not weakness, but hope, the yearning for partnership in a world where a woman's voice was currency only when spoken through a man. And when she faced exile and disgrace, it was not resignation but resilience, the kind of strength born only from a heart that has already been broken and still dares to love again. In Henry's England, power meant domination. To Margaret, power meant endurance. Her strength lay not in armies or decrees, but in her refusal to let despair define her. She understood that peace demanded empathy, that to end the endless chain of vengeance between England and Scotland, someone had to bear the wound without striking back. And so she did. It is easy to call her mistakes romantic, to see her choices as misguided. Yet what was her failure, if not the courage to act when silence would have been easier? Every alliance she forged, every letter she wrote, every risk she took was guided by something the men of her world could not understand. The conviction that empathy was not weakness, but the highest form of wisdom. In the Chronicles, Henry's reign is remembered in numbers and blood. 6 wives, 2 executed, 1 empire torn from the church. Margaret's legacy, softer but no less enduring, is measured in reconciliation, a peace her descendants would finally inherit. The contrast between them is the contrast between destruction and creation, between the noise of history and its quiet repair. And perhaps that is why her story still lingers, even through centuries of neglect. Henry's monuments are carved in stone, Margaret's in the unseen fabric of unity. His power ended with his last breath. Hers began only after she was gone. Her life was not the tale of a saint or martyr, but of a woman who understood the unbearable complexity of love, how it could wound and heal, betray and redeem, destroy and yet sustain. She did not love blindly. She knew precisely what her heart demanded and what it would cost her. That knowledge, not ignorance, made her love an act of courage. In a letter once attributed to her final years, Margaret wrote, "Those who mock the heart do not see its labour. It builds what swords can never hold." Whether the words were truly hers or only legend, they capture the essence of her truth. She was not a dreamer lost to sentiment. She was a strategist of feeling, a diplomat of emotion. It was that rare fusion of intellect and compassion that made her both extraordinary and dangerous. The courts of men feared women like her, women who could think and feel at once, who could balance tenderness with logic, mercy with insight. They were harder to predict, impossible to control. Margaret's tragedy was not that she loved too much, but that she loved in a time incapable of understanding such strength. She stood, in her own quiet way, as the first Tudor to grasp that power without empathy collapses upon itself. Henry's reign, for all its splendour, ended in paranoia and decay. Margaret's, forgotten in life, blossomed in legacy. One tore a kingdom apart to build a dynasty. The other stitched a broken island back together, thread by thread, through the quiet endurance of the heart. And though she died believing herself erased, history could not deny her entirely. The unity of crowns in the year 1603, the peace she had once begged for, became her unspoken monument. The Tudor rose, and the Scottish thistle, once divided by blood, grew together at last under her descendants' reign. Margaret's story reminds us that history's greatest acts of courage are not always loud. Sometimes they are whispered in letters, in choices, in the simple act of loving where hate is expected. She was not the iron monarch her brother was. She was something rarer, the embodiment of grace in an age of violence, the mind that understood that love, in all its risk and imperfection, is the truest form of power. And though the world condemned her for it, she never regretted her choice. For in a century ruled by men who believed war made them immortal, Margaret Tudor proved that compassion outlasts conquest. And now, let the story grow quiet. The candles are burning low, the air has softened, and Margaret's long shadow slowly fades into the distance. Her crown has long turned to dust, her name almost forgotten by the marble halls that once echoed it, yet, somehow, she still lingers here with us. Not as a queen, not as a rebel, but as a whisper of something timeless. The courage to choose love when the world demanded obedience. As you breathe slower, imagine her there, standing by the misted window of Methven Castle, the wind stirring her hair, the light of dawn painting her face in pale gold. She is no longer the queen torn between two kingdoms, no longer the sister of a ruthless king. She is simply a woman who lived, who felt deeply, who paid the price for feeling too much in a world that rewarded silence. Her story reminds us that even in history's coldest corners, compassion can glow like a hidden ember. That sometimes the gentlest acts, a letter written in faith, a hand extended in peace, a heart that refuses to harden, can change the course of nations. And though her life ended in solitude, her love outlived her. It crossed centuries, became bloodlines, and stitched together the two kingdoms she once stood between. Margaret Tudor teaches us something we often forget, that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is the decision to stay kind, even when kindness costs everything. It is choosing to understand, even when understanding breaks the heart. It is the soft, invisible labor of those who build bridges knowing they might never walk across them. So, as this story settles into silence, let her memory rest gently in your thoughts, a reminder that love, though fragile, is not weakness, that grace can be as powerful as power itself, and that history, for all its cruelty, always finds a way to remember the light. Let the room grow dim now. Let the voices of the past fade into the hush of night. The wind outside is calm again, and the queen who once defied empires can finally rest. May you too find rest tonight, knowing that every storm, even the fiercest one, must one day give way to peace. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well, and dream softly of castles bathed in moonlight, of forgotten queens, and of the quiet strength that lives inside every heart. And when you wake, don't forget to subscribe, so you can return, again and again, to these stories of courage, tenderness, and the gentle souls who changed history, one heartbeat at a time.